Warning, this episode contains hot takes, or at least medium takes. Last episode, we started to solve some of the issues facing Unaka City. The RER and new development, both public and private, did some good as it reduced car trips and added affordable walkable areas, and it allowed Unaka City to grow and enjoy its economic boom while preserving the beautiful mountains and valleys that surround it. However, this positive redevelopment only happened along a small sliver of the city, and most residents didn't benefit. Also, while racial inequality didn't get any worse with the redevelopment, it didn't get any better. Also, there were some promises made to the citizens when they approved funding, and those promises have to be kept. So we have some stuff to do. Make good on our promises for an improved bus system, focus on integration and racial equity, and spread the walkable developments out to other parts of the city. We will start with the promised bus network improvements. This will be different from the RER in a key way. Bus network redesigns are common in America, while RERs are basically non-existent. With the caveat out of the way, what is the current state of our buses? Well, in the inner city neighborhoods, they are following the same routes that the streetcars took 80 years ago and aren't very useful for cross-city travel, as all lines converge downtown and don't try to make transfers convenient. The routes that pass the hospital and university are well used, but that's it. Other cities in the region are a bit better as they have more modern routes and equipment. These suburban buses were all set up alongside the RER after all, but they all have the same problem of routes stopping at city limits. Fortunately, the creation of UWUTA did integrate fares, so Unaka City is doing much better than most regions, but improvements were promised and there's certainly room for improvement. As far as I can tell, the style of bus network redesign that will be adopted by Unaka City was first developed in Canadian cities and the Pacific Northwest, such as Portland, Seattle, Vancouver. In these places, also including Toronto, they redesigned their buses into a frequent grid, where buses travel along main roads every 15 minutes or better, making transfers possible, and with connections to light rail, metros, or regional rail, these cities have been very successful at growing transit ridership, even in formerly auto-oriented suburbs. The advantage of this frequent network can be described using one phrase transit planner Jarrett Walker often says: frequency is freedom. With this phrase, Walker lays out what makes transit useful compared to car transportation. You see, when thinking about trip time, which is the most important factor in transportation planning, the time spent waiting for the next bus or train is more important than the actual travel time. Thus, frequency increases, reduce wait times, and increase ridership. There's an inverse relationship there. This has been seen in the cities that started this trend: Seattle, Toronto, Vancouver, but also cities with less celebrated investments: Houston, Minneapolis, Richmond, and Jarrett Walker's firm has even created a plan for one of my inspiration cities, Chattanooga. It hasn't been implemented yet, but still. Oftentimes, the redesigns are framed as a way to more efficiently use the existing transit budget, that by shuffling around bus routes you can increase efficiency, which is true to an extent, but the real magic happens when enough resources are spent to really make the grid frequent. In Unaka City, we see these principles applied in two main ways. First, the grid that extends throughout the entire inner city. Even though Unaka City doesn't have the endless, perfectly rectangular street grids of Toronto, Minneapolis, or Western cities, a web can be woven, and now 1/3 of the entire region's population lives within a short walk of a frequent bus route, and has easy access to the entire region with a single transfer. This, in addition to new buses, including a wired electric trolley bus, and some areas with bus lanes, makes the citizens of North Hill and West Unaka quite satisfied that the promises were kept. The other way that modern network principles were applied to Unaka City was with cross-boundary bus lines. Bus lines now extend across city limits where appropriate, meaning that the system is rational and convenient. These changes double regional bus ridership and bump RER ridership 20% or so. This is the power of a well-connected network. An improvement anywhere increases utility everywhere. But UWUTA and urban planners were not content to rest on their laurels and came up with a plan to use buses as the tool to bring good walkable development to some of the deadliest roads in the region, while also growing the amount of affordable housing and integrating the suburbs. But before we look at that plan, I want to take a closer look at those last 2 points. So, gentrification. Now, it's very bad and destroys communities. It's very well, okay, but there is some stuff I like about it. It's got well, okay, but no, hold up. So gentrification is very hard to talk about because it means very different things to different people. Some people use it to talk about new development, others use it to refer to racial changes in a neighborhood, some use it to talk about block-to-block changes, and some talk about gentrification at a metro-wide scale. I want to offer my definition of this before I get too far. Gentrification, as I see it, is a neighborhood-level change in population that happens to an underinvested place when public and private money starts to return. Basically, it used to be crappy, it's nicer now, and some or all of the people who used to be there no longer live there. There are many things that are associated with it that don't have to happen necessarily, such as new development. Oftentimes, gentrification opponents will fight zoning changes, apartments, or other new buildings, but they still get priced out. This is known as displacement without development. Also, gentrification is closely associated with changes in racial demographics in a neighborhood, and I would argue this also isn't needed. If a neighborhood has lots of poor white people living in there, but then a bunch of rich Yankee hipsters move in, that would still count as gentrification. I do want to acknowledge, though, that the majority of cases is a racial change. Gentrification discussion also sucks up a lot of air in the urban planning discourse, and I would like to share some other perspectives on it. City Beautiful's video on San Francisco, Do Not Eat's video on gentrification in dense northern cities. My perspective on these is going to be pretty different, as I believe that gentrification in southern, mostly suburban cities acts differently than it does in the already dense cities on the west coast or in the north. On that note, the third perspective is Geography King's video. He specifically covers gentrification in Chattanooga, one of the inspirations for Unaka City. For my part, I think gentrification has brought some benefits, starting with integration. Yes, this is the hot take I mentioned earlier. So, southern cities have been starkly segregated since their inception. They have been slowly integrating since the 80s or so, with suburbs getting less white and the inner city getting less black. Another thing I want to highlight as a good aspect associated with gentrification would be that redevelopment and change in ownership. The redevelopment associated with gentrification has led to denser, more walkable, more transit-oriented cities. Charlotte's South End along the light rail line is some of the best transit-oriented development in the nation. Nashville's re-urbanization has allowed more people to live car-free. This development also brings missing businesses. In Chattanooga, new grocery stores in gentrifying areas have been vital in shrinking food deserts. So, there is some stuff to appreciate. In the last episode, I talked about the new development around RER stations and downtown as a purely positive change. But I want to share a more complicated story. Do you remember Fred Rustin and his family? They were chased out of their home by a mob in episode 2. Well, one of his daughters, Monique, grew up to share her mother's love of the zoo, and she became a zookeeper. She moved to West Unaka with her boyfriend and their daughter. But despite civil rights groups passing the Fair Housing Act, she still could not get a mortgage, despite the family's income. So, instead, they bought their home on an installment plan. It worked for her father, so why not for her? In 1992, several years into payments, she votes for the upzoning on the property, believing that once the home is paid off, she will be able to sell the home for a huge markup. After all, her buy-in price was locked in. However, after a few months, her boyfriend loses his job, and the budget gets tight. They make a payment 2 days late. In the past, this had not been an issue. But their landlord has the same thought about selling the home for a huge profit and evicts Monique Rustin and her family for breach of contract. This story gets at the heart of a misconception I had about gentrification and upzoning in inner streetcar suburbs. I grew up in this kind of neighborhood and didn't see why offering this kind of home to more people was bad. People sell their homes for a profit, and a walkable, transit-served neighborhood thrives. Everybody wins. Well, as I learned about rent-to-own, installment plans, and other rental homes in streetcar suburbs, I've developed a new framework and appreciation for the struggles. While neighborhoods do need to be able to change and grow, especially around transit, there has to be a way for people who live in a property to enjoy the benefits of growth. This starts by banning the most exploitative schemes, such as those installment plans or rent-to-own schemes I mentioned before. I want to take a minute to explain why I think these are so bad and exploitative. They masquerade as a real mortgage, but don't have the benefits and security of one. In a regular mortgage, you slowly build up ownership of the property as you pay off the principal, meaning that 50% of the way through a mortgage, you would get half the price of the home if it were to be sold. Plus, a foreclosure, while still painful, offers several rights and protections. None of these benefits exist in a rent-to-own or a contract home or whatever it is that the landlord is calling it. If you are 50% of the way through the contract, you don't own shit. You only have whatever rights and privileges the contract grants, and I'm sure the fine print isn't in your interest. If anything goes wrong, you just get plain old evicted. It's the illusion of safety with no actual protections that led to my realization that these simply need a banning. In Unaka City, the story of Monique Rustin and hundreds in her same situation got around and built up anxiety and resentment for further rezoning, which came up against planners' plans. To go alongside the expanded bus service, they wanted to upzone everything near frequent bus service, which would have been the entire city. At this first meeting, there was strong pushback, as fears of losing homes to gentrification and anxiety that they wouldn't get to see any of the benefits from this plan motivates citizens to speak up. Fortunately, like last time, the planners listened to residents' concerns and worked to identify the root cause of the fear and anxiety, holding community meetings, soliciting feedback. They decided to use the tried and true method of a land bank or a land trust with some tweaks to head off displacement and to rethink how the neighborhoods would grow. While land banks traditionally hold land that has been abandoned and remove or refurbish blighted homes, this one would have had an additional goal of transferring residents from exploitative contract homes or rent-to-own schemes to real mortgages. Then the long-term plan would be to fund homeowner-led redevelopment to ensure that citizens could benefit from the rezoning just as effectively as some real estate company based in Wilmington, Delaware. All of the meetings, the feedback, the listening to the community paid off, and the rezoning/land bank package passes with broad support. This allows these old streetcar neighborhoods to return to form, with shops and apartments concentrating near transit again for the first time in 50 years. Other parts of the region were also adding dense, walkable development, the suburbs of Hadestown and Lilac Park. But instead of spot TOD around stations, or broader urban fabric such as downtown or with the bus network, these changes were long corridors of walkable transit spines connecting important regional nodes. Previously, these were suburban arterials, where the strip malls of the 60s and 70s were being abandoned as new stores like Walmart opened in greenfield shopping centers at the edge of town. As a quick aside, if greenfield means construction on farms, fields, or forest, and brownfield means converting industrial sites to other purposes, then converting strip malls and parking lots should be grayfield development. But rezoning and transit have turned these into spines of good, walkable urban form. To understand the success and differences of these corridors, we need to look at the nodes they connect and why they were created. Both towns were worried about the abandoned strip malls becoming sources of blight and shrinking tax bases. So, redevelopment plans were drawn up. In Hadestown, the university was also planning a large expansion of the school, and student housing and general affordability for students was becoming an issue. The corridor was Orpheus Avenue, connecting an RER station to the university, then onto downtown. It was all zoned U2, the 9-story zoning code introduced last episode, after pushing from the university. And right next to the university and near the station, they used all 9 stories of it, for offices, classrooms, and student housing. Further down towards the center of the corridor, more modest 3- and 4-story buildings formed the walkable heart of the community. The transit that these were built around was planned at the same time Uwuta was building the bus network, so naturally the push was for buses. But Hadestown and Lilac Park wanted their corridors to be competitive, attractive places to live and work. So they made sure that these buses would be better than Unaka City's. This meant dedicated lanes, off-board fares, multi-door boarding, all the details that bring a bus service to its highest form. I hope this doesn't come as any surprise, but with good planning, good transit, political support, and a solid idea, these corridors were incredibly successful, allowing thousands more people to live in walkable places with access to high-quality transit. This also helped with the squeeze of gentrification, as several of the hipsters and immigrants seeking this car-free existence moved here instead of bidding up the rents in black communities. The dense development also addressed the town's budget concerns, as strip malls, abandoned as companies moved to greener pastures, became offices, bodegas, arcades, clothing stores, you name it. This growth in tax base rather than black holes in the budget meant that schools could be built, teachers get raises, and the budget just breathes easier in general. As the 90s came to an end, people were able to look back with pride and amazement. Nearly 100,000 new citizens moved into the region, but this growth happened without creating traffic, without clearing more forests, or paving over the beautiful mountains and valleys. Buses and trains proved more than capable of the new load and became some of the most widely read systems in the entire Southeast. Through smart growth and community-driven policies, this boom brought prosperity to everyone. With these successes, Unaka City has even more ambitious plans, doubling the length of the RER, building a second subway, bringing traffic accidents to zero, and highway removal.